Well, I'm here today to tell you how to become flipping rich. Wow, did that sound really shallow to you? It should have. Everybody knows there's some things in life that money just can't buy. In fact, the important things, right? Like purpose. So I'm going to leave it to you to answer the why am I here question. If you get that why am I here question right, the next thing you need to understand is how. How do you become flipping rich? You see, there's some things that money just can't buy, but for everything else, there's money. So what do you think of when you think of the American dream? Some people think of Bill Gates. They might think of Oprah Winfrey, or they might even think of this fellow, Jed Clampett. Now, this guy got rich just for being a bad shot, right? He was shooting for some food, and up from the ground came some bubbling crude, right? This is the Beverly Hillbilly. Well, the American dream was first articulated by James Russell Adams in 1931 in his book, The Epic of America. And in that book, he wrote the American dream. It's a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, regardless of their opportunity according to each ability and their achievement, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. So even though he was 2 years deep into the Great Depression, what we see is a dream that is saturated with hope. And the hope was different than hope found in other countries. In other countries, they had their royalty, they had their landed aristocracy. But in America, we had the land of opportunity. You didn't have to be born with it. In America, all people were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. This was a hope that was built on the idea that if you were lucky enough to live in America, then you were lucky enough. So, what happened to the American dream? It seems to me these days that the hope in the American dream has given way to cynicism. Generations have passed, and it starts to appear that maybe we can't get that dream after all. Maybe we have to be lucky. Maybe you do have to be born with it or win the lottery. So, 2 generations after James Russell Adams first articulated this dream, the researchers Stanley and Danko went in search to find out who were those lucky ones, who were those lucky millionaires. And they were as surprised as anybody to find, published in their book, The Millionaire Next Door, that the people in America who had become rich, 7 out of 8 of them were not from wealthy families. They were not born with it. They were first generation rich. And they didn't date movie stars. They didn't drive fancy cars. And you know what? They weren't living in mansions. They were living right next to you and me. Or in my case, they were living right upstairs. How could that be? I grew up poor. How could my parents end up millionaires? I mean, that seems impossible. If I grew up poor, my parents grew up much poorer. Mom was the 6th of 9 children. Grandpa, he was an undefeated prize fighter, 19-0, until he got knocked out of boxing. Not by a man, but by the Great Depression. The money ran out of boxing. He went looking for odd jobs. The family went to the fields. They picked, Mom was a 4-year-old, she babysat her little sister. Things weren't much different for my dad. When Dad was 8 years old, his family lost the farm in Missouri to the Dust Bowl. Well, losing the farm's tough enough, but when you've got to leave your little sister there who's buried, it's hard to lose your place to the bank, right? And yet, 2 years later, after looking for work, they finally end up in the World War II shipyards. They found some work 2,000 miles away. What I'm saying is, look, if my parents could make it, anybody could make it. You might fairly ask me then, why isn't everybody flipping rich? Here's my argument. Most people don't want to become a millionaire. They want to be one. Now that might seem like I'm just, mincing words here, but the difference is huge. To become a millionaire, you have to earn $1 million more than you spend. Most of us want to be a millionaire so we can spend $1 million we didn't earn, right? Well, so there's the key principle right there. You've got to earn more than you spend. That's it, the key principle. If you do that, then you've got something to invest. When I was a young professor at the Air Force Academy, I would explain to cadets that if they would just save $2,000 each year for 7 years, the first 7 years after they graduated, and never invest one more penny, 37 years after that, when they retired at the age of 65, they would have over $1.2 million saved if they made the same rate of return, the historical rate of return on the stock market. If, on the other hand, right after they graduated, if they didn't save anything for the first 7 years, and then started saving $2,000 every year for the next 37 years, they would retire with less. The point's kind of simple. You need to start early. It's what we call compound interest. There's just 3 variables: principal, rate, and time. The amount of your investment, your return on investment, and the time you have to let it grow. Albert Einstein was so fascinated with this concept, he called it the 8th wonder of the world. Compound interest. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it. One of these cadets are bright people, and we interviewed them 1 year after they graduated. And you know what we found? They did the exact opposite. We found that on average, they spent $2,000 more than they earned. Now, keep in mind that when cadets graduate, they go straight to being an officer at the Air Force. They've got a well-paying job from the day one. But they got themselves into debt. Now, what's the problem with debt? Debt is a giant hope sucker. Okay? What I mean by that is debt is simply a way of putting into dollars how much of your future you've spent in the past. So you've got to earn more than you spend. You don't want the 8th wonder of the world working against you. So you might say, okay, how do I do that? 3 simple tips for you to earn more than you spend. I'd say they're foolproof, almost foolproof. They're 3,000 years old. They come from that most famous of sages, wise man, and multi-billionaire, Solomon. This cuts across cultures, political systems, economic systems. 3 simple tips that work. The first one is this: do something. So when I was 5 years old, my parents bought the farm. Literally, thankfully. They bought this. I mean, we lived in the suburbs. We were renting. They could have bought a house in the suburbs, but instead, they went out in the country and bought this big dilapidated barn, a chicken coop, and 2 houses that I swear were haunted. The grass was taller than I was. Dad tried to mow the grass. Remember, it ruined the lawnmower. Okay? Well, a year later, we planted our first Christmas trees. Dad bought us these big green buttons that said, "Christmas trees, America's renewable resource." And then he loved to go around and tell people his model of a small businessman, an overly ambitious father with not too bright of sons. That's where I came in, apparently. Well, I said we grew up poor because here's the problem with Christmas trees. It takes 7 to 10 years before you've got anything you can sell. So you got nothing but expenses, right? Well, 30 years later, unfortunately I was gone by then, but Sunset Magazine, our tree farm, ended up in the best tree farms in the nation. And along the way, well, we all had jobs and it helped us pay for college, just as my parents had done. Now, just up the street, beautiful farmhouse. It was a Craftsman bay window. I love that house. In that same 30 years, that house collapsed. It's out in the Portland area, rains a lot, blackberry vines overgrew the thing, and it just ended up being bulldozed down. And from that, I learned this basic principle. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a bandit, scarcity like an armed man. So do something. The second thing is do something right. Planting trees can be hard work. You jump on the shovel, you dig a hole, and the key is to get the roots to go down deep and straight. Now, I've planted thousands of trees, and I'll tell you, sometimes it doesn't work. You jump on that shovel, and it goes in about this deep. Now, you've got a couple options here. One of them is to fake it. You can take that same little hole and work the tree down in there and stomp around, and it stands up nice and straight. The only problem is when summer comes, it dies. And so does your hope with a prophet. And so Solomon said to do something and do it right. He said the person who follows a right path is like the first gleam of dawn, shining ever brighter as the day comes. So do something and do it right. Now, the final principle is this. It's to be generous. And I've got to tell you, this one, as an accountant, makes no sense. I can totally understand you being skeptical. The math simply doesn't work, right? If I've got $10 and I give away 3 of them, I'm down to 7. How was it that Solomon observed that one man would give generously and have even more? The stingy man withholds unduly and comes to poverty. So, how can generosity make you rich? It could be a spiritual principle. I'm going to give you a more down-to-earth explanation. When I have a generous heart, I see the people around me who have less. And when I see the people around me who have less, I realize I have enough to share, but it also makes me thankful. It makes me content. But when I have a stingy spirit, I see all those people around me who have more than me. And quite frankly, even the richest person in the world still doesn't own most of it. It's a never-ending trap. In fact, Greg Easterbrook, in his book, The Progress Paradox, How Life Gets Better While People Feel Worse, he followed people from 1960 to 2000 in the US Census, and he found that our per capita income had more than doubled over those 40 years. That's adjusted for inflation. And yet, at the same time, he found a marked uptick in people's unhappiness. The point is this: wealth is not sufficient to achieve the American dream. Wealth is not sufficient to achieve the American dream. I think the problem is this: we try to measure riches by the person next to us. If your definition of rich is having more than your neighbor, you can't win that battle. I think we need to change our definition. We need to flip that definition from having more than our neighbor to having more than enough. Life is short, right? Everybody knows nobody takes it with them. With generosity, it's the only proven way to get beyond yourself. In fact, I would argue it allows you to break the time barrier. So, going back to that 8th wonder of the world, even the smallest gift with enough time becomes immeasurable. So do something, do it right, and be generous. Only then will you truly be flipping rich.